Good afternoon, good evening, good morning, depending on where you are, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you so much for joining us today. This is the first of a monthly series of webinars that organised by the European Aviation Conference Institute. We're delighted you can be here. We're delighted you can join us. My name is Andrew Charlton. I have the honour of moderating today's panel. We are talking today almost as a wrap-up for what was discussed at the EACI conference in Luxembourg at the end of November, start of December last year. And the topic today is giving air cargo what it deserves, and which was, in general terms, the theme of the EACI conference as well. I've got to say, I've been in aviation for a very long time, and I don't remember a general conference rather than a conference organised specifically by the cargo industry that focused on cargo. And I think that of itself is quite interesting. We have a really terrific panel today to talk about the conference and to talk about what arises from that, and importantly, what is it that cargo does deserve. So in ascending order of involvement in the conference, I'm delighted to introduce Mr. Carlos Grautana. Carlos is actually the Director General of the General Express Association, but he is not here today speaking on that basis. He's here on his own basis. Obviously, what he doesn't know about express cargo isn't worth knowing, but nevertheless, he's not actually representing his organisation today, nor did he represent his organisation at the conference. But Carlos was there for the entire conference and has his own views, of course, and I'll be really keen to hear what they are. We then have Dr. Anna Lang from the University in Frankfurt, who was there and who, in fact, as I say, in increasing roles of involvement, was engaged in some of the program development. And then finally, Dr. Benny Martin, who was actually the organizer of the conference, the entire conference. And so he really had his hands deep into the machine of grease up to his elbows, I think, to try to work it all out and to see what was going on. So with that introduction, I've probably mangled both your titles and your pronunciations, and I apologise for that. For what it's worth, I am an equal opportunity offender in these sorts of matters. Can I start perhaps with you, Carlos? Outside looking in, what were the three takeaways you took from the conference?
Well, first of all, a very good afternoon from Geneva, Switzerland, and thank you so much for having me in my new capacity as a learned member of the audience, which is one I quite enjoy. And thanks for the opportunity. So, three takeaways, yes. I think you've mentioned one, Andrew, and the very first one that comes to mind is the fact that a general, long-established general conference on aviation focused on air cargo for the first time. I think that was long overdue, and in and of itself, it's a good sign, and it's an excellent development. I think I was very excited about that. Secondly, I would say we heard exciting new viewpoints from some regulators about liberalizing air cargo. We heard from Latin America and from other regions, generally very positive in a way that is quite different to the things we were hearing before the pandemic. So there's a bit of a change of a mindset, a mood swing, if you will. But at the same time, this is happening against a backdrop where there are, renewed fears about protectionism in world trade, nearshoring, friendshoring, shifting of supply chains. So it's an interesting contrast. And last but not least, certainly sustainability. It was mentioned a number of times, and perhaps it's the flip side of the coin. We heard about the challenges that the industry will face in this area, and that opens up a whole series of questions as well. So these are my three takeaways.
Okay, thank you. Can I just probe for a moment the deregulation point, because I suspect we will talk about sustainability, because I believe it's mandatory that you have to talk about sustainability. What was the development? I mean, we had an amazing session where we had air service agreements. I'll get it if it kills me. Air service agreement negotiators from Latin America, from Europe, from Asia as well, all sitting on the same stage. It's got to be said, I had never seen that before, even in the passenger side. What's happening on the regulatory side that was of interest to you?
To me personally, I think it's the fact that for the first time people are considering opening up air services agreements to air cargo, perhaps separately from passenger traffic rights, and all the way up to a seventh freedom. And we had a clear example of that in the room in Latin America, the Latin American Civil Aviation Conference, which is kind of a mini regional ICAO of sorts that brings together the
It's sort of the
regulators.
Latin American, is it the Latin American EACI, for want of a better expression?
Yes, that is a good comparison for Latin America and the Caribbean. And 10 of the members tested a new approach during the pandemic, whereby they decided to open up air cargo to seventh freedom amongst themselves. They said, well, we'll test this for 2 years, see how it goes. So it turns out that they very much liked what came out of the experiment, to the point that last December we heard they signed a permanent instrument, a memorandum of understanding that I'll skip all the legal implications of that and why this avenue was chosen versus a more formal one, but they've made that into a permanent policy amongst the 10. I suspect that with the current change in Argentina, there might be an 11th country coming online. And I think that sets a very, very clear precedent for discussions that will take place later this spring in ICAO. And I know that other regions are looking at this experiment with interest. You would raise this issue before the pandemic, and you would have a lot of opposition in many corners saying, no, we can't do that. I think the pandemic opened many eyes and changed many mindsets. And well, here's a group of countries that have gone ahead and done it. So successfully, apparently, they're happy with the results. So it sets a really interesting precedent. And I think that's a big change.
Excellent. I don't know. I've just assumed Argentina was in it from the get-go, but I'm interested to hear they're not. Anna, what were your 3 takeaways? Or do you want to talk about the regulatory stuff before you get to that?
I had a quick question to Carlos, but
Can I continue?
Please.
Can you pick me up, or can we bring up to speed how that works technically with the seventh freedom rights in that case? Because I guess it only applies to all cargo carriers, essentially, right? It's like how
Yes.
the combi carriers benefit
for the viewers
from
at home. For the viewers at home, do we need to explain what seventh freedoms are?
The ability to fly between 2 countries with an aircraft that is not licensed by either country.
So to use an example, the aeroplane could have been registered in Argentina, but it then could have flown to Brazil, picked up some cargo and flown from there to Chile.
Correct. Yes, exactly. Or it could be a Peruvian aircraft and crew carrying cargo between Brazil and Chile, for instance.
Yeah. Okay. Sorry, Anna, your question.
well, as far as I'm aware,
that's quite hard, and I not really implemented for passenger transport, right? So when we do this now, how did it work for them? So it's basically only for all cargo airlines or for express cargo, I guess, right?
No, I understand it is for all cargo airlines from the region, which introduces an interesting nuance. And the capacity was badly needed during the pandemic. And so they deployed these fleets really following what the market needed in a very free way. And all countries involved said they were very happy with the result because they got extra capacity, extra flexibility. And I think that word flexibility is going to be one that we're going to say a lot during this hour.
Right. But the question then, but it only applied for the cargo. So the passenger, if the airline had cargo in its belly, the passenger aircraft couldn't take advantage of this. Is that right?
Well, during the pandemic, there were no much.
Passengers. Yeah,
exactly. So one of the issues that we saw during the pandemic is that 45% of the world's air cargo capacity, which is the one that is carried in passenger belly holds, practically vanished overnight. So the question is moot, at least for the 2 years of the pandemic when the memorandum of understanding was tried out. Not so much now. Some people think you should look at cargo generally, not just cargo carried by all cargo airlines or freighters. But in that case, I think the circumstances imposed that very narrow take, if you will, because that's what was available on the market, freighters.
As the capacity of under the belly vanished, there was this need to really utilize those available freighters and ask them to fly between all countries, right?
That's the take that they had in Latin America. But more generally, they thought, well, let's turn this into a completely new policy, even after the pandemic, and that's exactly what they've done. But yes, you're right. You needed to deploy the available capacity as optimally as possible. And in some cases, that means, you need to accept that planes that would not have traditionally had the traffic rights between country A and country B were needed. So these countries said, fine, I don't care where the airliner is from, provided it's from the region, they can fly.
Provided it's from the region. So there was still a certain amount of nationalism or regionalism, in this case, coming in.
I think it was dictated by the very nature of the authors. I mean, it's a regional entity after all.
True. Fair point. Thank you. Can we, just before we move on to you, Anna, I'm sorry to keep you waiting on this, but is it worthwhile for us to get a few benchmarks down? I noticed the first statistic that I think is really interesting, and it's really important that everybody understands, is that 45% of air freight capacity is in the belly of passenger aeroplanes, meaning that 55% is carried by freighter aircraft. Are we all happy with that? Is that correct? Nodding heads. That's very good. Thank you. And then the second statistic, just to get it out and on the record, air cargo is about 5% of the volume of all cargo, but it's about 35% of the value of all cargo. I think that's right. Yeah. And therefore, given the value of world trade is measured in something in the order of $8 trillion, we're talking multiple trillions of dollars worth of value gets carried on the bottom in freighters or underneath aeroplanes, on the bottom half of aeroplanes.
That's correct.
Yeah. And yet this is the first conference in your 30 years in aviation that's been about cargo. And yet we're talking trillions. And I'm sorry to have kept you waiting. Sorry, Ben.
There's one more related statistic that I don't know the precise numbers, but it was mentioned during the conference that cargo has a greater value-added contribution to GDP than air passengers.
Yeah,
correct. I think that the statistic comes from IATA, if I recall it correctly, and I'm not particularly good at remembering figures, but these are pre-pandemic figures, and I recall that roughly the multiple was 8 times. So the value of the cargo in terms of imports and export generated for the economy is 8 times the value of tourism, for instance.
Yeah, I remember an order of magnitude, so it's basically the same, roughly the same number.
But 8 times is a lot.
Oh yeah, and tourism is what, 10% of the world's economy, so we're talking serious amounts here. Yeah, Annie, you've been very patient. What were your takeaways from the conference?
I think I partially
Initiated that discussion, right? So thank you. I think
That's all right.
I can echo Carlos on some of the points. I think I very much enjoyed the conference on cargo. At the same time, I also enjoyed that there were a lot of passenger contributors in the room who were willing to think and discuss alongside the cargo questions. I think that was also very fascinating to me to see how these two communities very much is just one aviation community, and how it can also transition between one and the other. So I enjoyed that one very much at the conference. Sustainability, obviously, kind of the elephant in the room, and we needed to talk about this, and we spoke about it a lot, and I guess we will later on. What I was a bit maybe hoping for more than what I heard at the conference is more creative solutions towards this. And we saw a lot of very interesting takeaways of different ways to do this, but it seems a bit like, yeah, so I was hoping for more inspiration there, and maybe we can identify some of that later on or foster research to take this further, right? What else did I take away from it? I thought the conference was great in exploring air cargos in very many dimensions. I personally tend to have more of a process focus that involves a lot of ground operations, a lot of road transport. That to me is an integral part of air cargo. And I was quite surprised or quite flashed with the dimension of things that we discussed that didn't even touch that. So there was a lot of topics that I wasn't aware of that much that we discussed, like liberalization and those kind of things. Maybe more on the econ side, but I very much enjoyed that at the conference. Yes.
Speaking as an aviation guy, and we don't do trucks. We don't do trucks. We only do airplanes. I'll come back to sustainability.
All the cargo at the airports, right?
Yeah, not our problem. Not our problem after that. We'll come back to sustainability very shortly. But Benny, let me start by saying congratulations and thank you again. I thought it was a terrific conference and really well organised, and it really showed how much hard work you must have put in. But having said that, and I'm sure I speak for everybody who was there, what were your sort of three main takeaways?
Well, thank you for the compliments. Before getting to the main takeaways, I would like to first thank everyone who was involved. It was a massive effort. It was a great undertaking. And as you have witnessed, it was quite successful. It was not an easy path to get there. Running a conference is a challenge. Running a conference on cargo is a bigger challenge, and running a conference on cargo when EACI has been focusing on passenger for the previous 24 years, it was an even tougher challenge. And so I'm really glad and grateful to all those who were involved, those who were part of the program committee that brought together all the great list of practitioners, policymakers, and researchers together to discuss a wide scope of different topics around cargo. I will just briefly mention some of the themes that have been guiding our principles. Basically, some have come up already in earlier discussions today already: digitalization, the need for increased transparency, liberalization and the scope of service agreements, the role of cargo in global trade and how it's shaping global supply chains and how countries get together in different scopes, the required ambitions that need to go along, and along with that the potential demand management that may be required to make sure that we are progressing along the relevant path. We realized quite vividly that there is not enough research on cargo. What are the drivers of air freight flows? How to level the global playing field? And another question that I was thinking is whether air freight is the solution to supply chain disruptions, or do we need to stock more inventory? What comes to mind here is that, as we have seen during COVID days, suddenly air freight was the king of the castles, and now that we have challenges along the Suez Canal, again, air freight is becoming the winner of the day. At the same time, there is role for financial incentives, and one of the messages that came from the conference is that one of the reasons that we have so much freight is because investors are looking for liquidity, and in order to have liquidity, you are eliminating some of the inventory that you have in your system, which means that whenever you have a hiccup along the way in your supply chains, you have to expedite your deliveries and use air freight instead of taking it from your stock of inventory. Last question that I can think of right now, but naturally there are many more, is whether drones are going to play a fundamental scope in air freight, or will they simply become a solution for remote areas, basically connecting islands and other remote areas that the traditional freight is not going to serve. Looking at different countries or different continents, whether we need to drill down to look at certain levels of GDP, certain level of industrial activities or service activities, to identify the need for additional flows, and therefore to start liberalizing ahead of time to facilitate activities.
That's very interesting, isn't it? Because if you think about the flower growers and the bean growers of Kenya, I mean, absolutely no disrespect to Kenya and absolutely nothing but respect for it, but I suspect they would fall a fair way down your GDP chart, but yet they are a serious player in the air freight industry. or they are a serious recipient of air freight services anyway.
They are receiving services, but I guess that most of the services that they are receiving is mostly backhaul services that basically they are piggybacking on other flows that go down to Africa, and in order to bring back the planes, when they bring back the planes, they get a service that is essentially aimed at covering the cost of flying back. I'm not sure that I don't.
I was going to say beans as ballast. You mean beans as ballast in the old shipping terms?
In a way, yeah. So
yeah.
I don't know all the global flows and how much companies and different users are paying for the different services, but there might be some opportunities for exploration if we could get access to some data. So data is the new oil. And certainly data is the new oil, not just for cargo operators, for service providers, but also for researchers. And one of the things that we try to do as part of the conference is to facilitate some data lake for research, but unfortunately, we are not there yet. Hopefully, we will find some companies who will be willing to share some data and make it publicly available so that we can explore deeper the need for cargo flows.
Thank you. If data is the new oil, or data is the new oil, let's turn to sustainability, which is the old oil, the current oil, the existing oil. Let me say, I think there are 3 or 4 things we absolutely need to talk about over and above. One is sustainability, digitalization, which I'm going to lump in with the discussion about drones and autonomy and those sorts of things. The need for research, and possibly the discussion about globalization versus nationalism and those sorts of issues. But let me start, as I say, with the old oil, the existing oil, sustainability. Carlos, is it an issue for your members?
It is a huge issue. I mean, it's understood to be, very central to the business model and to the proposition, and serious efforts are being deployed to make sure that the business is as sustainable as it can. You would see, very serious reports on emissions and the amount of sustainable aviation fuel that is purchased, or the investment into electrification of last mile fleets and so on. So yes, it is an issue, and right. The flying part of the business is a particularly important issue.
What percentage of your members' business is actually the flying, and what percentage is the last mile?
Measured in terms of what?
Well, I guess, I don't know, good question. The first mile and the last mile must add up to a substantial part of the activity of your members' businesses, though, surely. What is the right unit to be measuring here?
It's a good question. I don't know what you're looking at precisely, but we look at it. I mean, someone said we don't do trucks in an aviation conference. True, but when you look at logistics, you look at trucks as well, and you look at vans and all sorts of vehicles. So it's an integrated chain.
Yeah, well, exactly. It's an integrated chain. I mean, I guess but the trucks and the vehicles, it's much easier to make them sustainable, electric, and so forth. It's the elephant in the room is the big aeroplanes in the middle, isn't it?
I think that's right.
Yeah. And what particularly did you think about when you mentioned sustainability as one of your takeaways? What were you aiming at there?
Well, I think I was just going to challenge
Carlos on this a bit, but I think well, I'm not sure if that was, but what I feel, what I
I'm a member of the audience, remember?
No, but you're, I mean, entirely, but maybe this is then in that sense, it's a general comment, but what I heard you saying is we're going to look into the sustainability to the degree that it's possible. And I think maybe this is a personal view, but aviation, it has a big sustainability issue. And at the moment, I feel I would love to hear more about the question of, so how can we really advance there? I do see all the initiatives, and I think sustainable aviation fuels is a big thing, especially for cargo, which is typically long distance, right? It would be intercont flights a lot of times. Mm-hmm. I don't see hydrogen or electric helping any air cargo plane in the near future. So we need sustainable aviation fuels. We also all know that it's simply not out there to the amount that we need it, right? And it's not going to be there tomorrow and not next year either. So So I mean, there isn't much to do, right? Either we fly and then we need to find a solution, or we simply don't fly, right? And the logistics or the airlines obviously are interested in doing something there, because not only that it becomes more sustainable, but also that reducing emissions means you're burning less kerosene or less stuff, which simply is cheaper, right? So I think I don't have the real solution yet, but I would really hope the industry pushes a bit further, and that's what I meant with being creative.
It is pushing. I mean, I know that, you know, there's big investments in sustainable aviation fuel being done as we speak. How much of it is available is another question, but the industry is ready to buy.
Yeah, true.
So,
And
but
And
the
I
important
hope
question-
that the policy choices don't narrow down to that binary proposition of either we fly or we don't. I hope that's not what we're talking about.
No, but I mean, to have the amount of
Sustainable aviation fuel is not only about increasing production capacity, it's also we need the renewable energy to foster the process, right? Sorry to say, but being based in Germany, we have a limited capacity on that end.
Yeah, but to what extent is that beyond the reach of the aviation industry proper? You know, they're doing what they can, saying we're signaling, we're ready to buy, we are buying, but we don't manufacture it.
Yeah.
So let's see.
And we also heard
research.
during the conference, we also heard a fairly large manufacturer say that one of the, you know, mainstays of you know, the air cargo business in terms of aircraft is going to be produced for the next decade. So what kind of new aircraft are there out for operators to buy? That's another question.
As befits Carlos's position as a DG of a major organisation, he's been coy, but basically what he was saying is one of the representatives on the very first panel from Boeing said that they're going to continue to build as freighters the 767 aeroplane. At least I'm assuming, Carlos, that's what you're talking about.
Maybe.
I'll take that as a yes. And the 76 is an airplane that's been around since at least the 1980s, I think, something like that. Certainly for a very long time. But is there no appetite from your members, Carlos, or indeed from, or more generally, is there no appetite for freight operators to also get 787s and the increasingly efficient, more modern airframes? Why are you clinging so? Why does the freight industry cling so desperately to older airframes? Is it just that they're cheaper?
So again, I'm speaking as a lab member of the audience, not
Yeah, I understand that. No, I'm asking you as a general question. It's not about
but
your
in a personal
members.
capacity. So the question is, how many can they produce and how fast? I mean, clearly refleeting is one of the main solutions here to reduce the carbon intensity of flying.
Indeed.
You know, how many freighters of the new generation are available to buy right now? What is the delay in delivery? That's a question that one should ask as well.
Indeed. But as a member of the audience, did you get the impression that the cargo industry is keen on refleeting and is keen on addressing the sustainability issues at that fundamental level?
Very much so.
Right. Was that the impression you had, Anne?
Well, at the conference,
I would agree. In general, it may just be me, and maybe it's also about the leading cargo companies and maybe the followers on those markets. But I do see a lot of passenger conversions of into freighters, where we see old passenger aircraft being converted to freighters, and that are going to be in the air for quite a while, right? So yes, and it's also a question of what is available in the market to purchase new aircraft. But purchasing new aircraft is simply a major investment, right? It's like an airline cannot, or at least will not, entirely swap its fleet just because they're more economic or more environmentally friendly. I see the challenge there for sure.
So Benny, was that your impression as well from your perspective?
Yeah, I think it's a nuanced situation where they do make a purchase nowadays for assets that will last for 25 years, maybe more. And when they make the decision right now, that's what's out there. If I'm taking a comparison to the maritime industry, they have to move their act a little bit faster. So many have been sitting on the fence for a while to see what kind of solutions are going to emerge, whether it's going to be more hydrogen, methane, or so forth. You cannot do that in the airline industry. You cannot sit on the fence, because we know any airplane that will start, that will go on the into the planning process will take another 15 years before it will move down to the production line. So basically, the bar now, knowing that by 2050 they will have to go carbon neutral. So I guess everyone is just simply relying on SAF and as the near-term solution. Long-term solutions are still kind of vague at the moment.
Yeah.
One thing that came up is probably the option of airships, but this requires a different mindset, moving a little bit slower and crafting different airports, I think. I don't know if you will call them airports when you have a Zeppelin coming with 300 passengers and so many tons of cargo.
Yeah, it's when they tether to the top of buildings. I actually think the word airport is probably exactly correct at that point. Certainly, and remember the spike on the top of the Empire State Building was specifically for Zeppelins to tether to. So you could have then got off onto the top of the Empire State Building.
So it's back to the future.
Indeed, indeed, and of course we're almost tipping into the subject, and now's as good a time as any, because there's certainly a lot of work going on in the drone space for large cargo carrying drones, which would of course be unmanned or uncrewed.
Let me pick up that drone question. I was discussing something similar recently with a logistics service provider. I mean, we see new ideas that are coming up on the market, but for the time being, I'm a bit afraid that we may not really see drones being the mode of choice for cargo, right? I mean, there are special cases where we do see that, right? When you go to a remote island, when you have emergency situations, when you're going to some remote place in the mountains or something like that. But in order to substitute what a 777F brings in terms of cargo with a drone, I think we still have ways to go, and I'm quite interested to see how that airspace management is going to work. If we have that fleet
one GoPro camera at a time, that's how you'll deliver them.
Well, I'm not entirely sure this is going to save our efforts there.
No.
If you're speaking about digitalization a bit more general, I think that's an industry that really still has a ways to go. But on the other hand, it's also an opportunity, because many other industries and even passenger aviation is somewhat more advanced than cargo, I would say, at least from my outside perspective. So cargo can actually pick up at a very high level, right? It doesn't need to make the beginner's errors anymore, and can really try to provide visibility across the entire transport chain, even outside of integrated companies, and really help and really try to leverage the knowledge there.
True, but I think that while some of the cargo players are really very advanced in terms of digitalization, it's a question also of interfaces with government agencies. Okay, so you have an e-airway bill, but who can read it? Or you have an e-customs declaration, but who can read it again? And what is the standard you use to convey that? So there's a lot to be done. There's a lot of potential. I think that would probably also take friction out of supply chains, with potential environmental effects as well, positive ones. And we heard from the International Chamber of Commerce, or one of the speakers at least, referred to the efforts that the Digital Standards Initiative of the International Chamber of Commerce is doing. And they're doing really interesting strides. And I think they're heading in exactly that direction of mapping all sorts of documents that exist for trade and providing digital standards for them so that they are interoperable. Interoperability is a huge issue when it comes to digitalization, because you might have fantastic digital services and systems yourself, but you need to connect them to other people in international trade.
International trade is sort of the... Oh, sorry, go ahead.
Sorry. I was like, I may have a delay here. I was just going to say, as a passenger, right, we all used to, you travel with your phone, right? And you don't need a lot of other stuff. And you're good to cross borders with a pre-notification that the airlines need to send and all of that. So there must be a way, if the passengers manage it. I'm kind of optimistic that at some point cargo is going to get there as well.
and there is a lot is being done, a lot has been done already, and more needs to be done. But yeah, I mean, there's tremendous potential there. And I'm sure if you talk to cargo airlines or cargo operators generally, they're huge supporters of that. But again, there needs to be an effort in standardization, or rather interoperability. I think that's the key word.
But the benefit we reap from this is actually the reduction of friction, isn't it?
Correct.
Air freight, and indeed air transport generally, is sort of the ultimate analog industry, isn't it? I mean, there is no teleporting, so we're going to physically have to pick stuff up, put it on a device, take it to another place, and then unload it, whether you're talking passengers or cargo. It's sort of the definition of an analog industry. So all we can use digitization, I wish I knew the difference, digitization for is to reduce the friction. One assumes that has a cost benefit, though.
But it's the reducing the friction in the information flows that travels with the physical goods. So, you know, all the data about what's carried, who's shipping it, where is it going to, what's the worth, you know, what's the weight, all that can be conveyed electronically or on paper. And there's a number of trade-related documents that are still paper-based. And I think that's where you have a potential for reducing a lot of friction and making it faster so that it doesn't need to sit in warehouses for so long and so forth.
And I think that friction and removing
That friction has a potential environmental benefit, right? I mean, once we know what cargo is where and when it's going to be there, what its status updates are, and all of that type of information on a reliable global basis, or like not global, but like on a reliable basis across multiple actors, that allows to optimize road transport for pickup and delivery, for instance. That allows to potentially ensure that there is no cargo capacity left on an aircraft that's going anyway. So those kind of things, I think we do see in the express business that it's doable, and there you will have a track and trace of your shipment basically worldwide, right? So and it turns out to be more challenging, maybe because it's more fragmented, but in general, cargo, it's not as easy, I would say, not on that scale.
And on that note, I'd like to make a link that perhaps we didn't make earlier, which is a link between sustainability and liberalization. And there is one, I think, because if you can deploy your fleet to follow demand patterns, and in the air cargo industry, these are changing very quickly all the time, then you can optimize that operation. Today, that's not necessarily the case everywhere. So by making sure that capacity is deployed where it's needed at its optimum, you can also have an environmental effect, because it doesn't have to take circuitous routes to get there. And the industry saw during the pandemic, sorry, Benny, for a second,
no,
is,
go ahead.
you know, that point of flexibility that I mentioned earlier was central, because, you know, 20 years ago, air cargo airlines were carrying music in CDs. That's not the case today. They carry something else. But during the pandemic, what needed to be carried from where to where changed literally overnight, and fleets had to be redeployed to meet that demand, which also explains what we were talking about earlier about Latin America. So that link in terms of flexibility, optimization of deployment of fleets is there, I think, and it's a very strong one.
There are 2 points coming from this type of discussion, like who has access to the data and what do they do with it? And second, whether we're going to move into what is known as the sustainability paradox. By improving the whole system and making it far more efficient, obviously we're going to drop the price, which may increase the attractivity of air freight. So that's something that we might want to consider.
Something else to worry about.
Yeah, I mean, it's like some light bulbs, when they become cheaper, suddenly you notice more of them.
Right.
But maybe I could go back quickly to the question you have actually asked me before, the drones. I hold the view that drones are not going to be massively employed throughout the supply chain, certainly not in cities. I can hardly see regulators giving them the permit to fly between houses, between high rises, because there is a severe risk of one is espionage, but less than that, more than that, is the risk of hacking. Somebody can just hack your system and crash it to some buildings. So I can hardly see any drones operating freely within the boundaries of residential areas. So most likely they will remain highly employed in deployed in remote regions. We see them a lot in agriculture where there is nothing on the horizon. So probably they will feed into the end nodes of the supply chains, either by delivering to the final spots or bringing the items into the supply chains, into some nodes of feeder connections to the rest of the supply chain.
What about automation more generally? I mean, that drones are an example, obviously, but cargo and loading cargo onto an airplane is almost a game of Jenga, isn't it? I mean,
yeah,
really quite a complex one. Well, obviously you can put them in a pallet, but to maximize the space in the pallet to get all the pallets in the right places, do we make ourselves smarter by using digitalization, AI, whatever, for that, do you think?
That's a great question. I know of some companies that are looking into some solutions, but maybe Anne would know a little bit better than me, or maybe even Carlos. I think they've seen more floors of cargo handling, but from my little experience, you will see some guys there with explosive brains. They can look at all the stuff that is laid out on the floor and say, this goes first, this goes second, and amazingly they build up the platform that goes into the belly.
Or the
some of the systems already are being tested.
Have you got any experience of that? Anything you can sort of use as an example?
Well, I've seen companies that use drones for warehouse management that can do inventories very, very quickly of what is in the warehouse, and then build your ideal pallet, for instance.
Right. So it flies around the warehouse. It looks at what's out there,
and it inventorizes the place very, very quickly and tells you, the weights, the dimensions, the origins and destinations, and it allows you to build a Tetris that is optimum.
Right. I mean, that's quite exciting.
I guess within your warehouse it's a little bit easier, but if you're looking at, because then you control what's in your warehouse, but when you look at the ground handling, then you have all sorts of different parts that have different sizes, different shapes, different weights, different handlings. I think that's a little bit more delicate. So you have to scan completely each of them and decide whether it's fragile and it needs to be on top, whether it's solid and can be lower.
Yeah, and weight and size, and a number of other things.
And then weight and trim on the aircraft itself. Yeah. But again, I'd have thought, a clever AI system could surely take on all those sorts of things. And did I catch you?
And then balance the weight within the plane.
Yeah, weight and trim. Yeah. And did I cut you off? Were you about to say something?
No, I was just going to say, I mean,
I've also seen those demos, but I have to admit I haven't seen them live yet, where you have augmented reality glasses that will more or less scan what Benny just described as standing around to be placed on a pallet. It will recognize all kinds of labels that you have, like fragile and whatever, and will make a suggestion on how you build the Tetris, to stick to that picture.
Right.
But
sometimes you cannot flip them over.
Well, there is technical elements that I think all of them need to address somehow, but I'm always impressed when I have a chance to see how it works, how good the human worker there is. I mean, if an experienced person is building up a pallet, I'm always wondering how much actually there can be gained, because those things pretty much, I mean, they may not be filled with the ideal stuff that's in the warehouse, to come back to Carlos' point, but from what is around, they're pretty good in filling up these pallets, and I wouldn't really see how it kind of rotating the Tetris around really allows you to put more on the pallet.
Interesting. We've got about 10 minutes left, and I've still got two topics I want to cover. So as interesting as that is, I might ask if we could move on. The two topics we've still got to talk about are the research point and what do we need and how do we get it, data, but what do we and how do we get it? And then my second point is the whole title of today's webinar is giving cargo what it deserves, and what is it that cargo air freight deserves? So let me start with the research, and maybe Benny, start with you. What research, what impediments do you see to the research that needs to be done, and how do we get over those impediments?
Yeah, so one is data or data.
God, what a shock.
And it doesn't come as a surprise to all of us, of course. But I think we need to enforce the notion that we need data, we need it. One thing that we have tried in the past and is to convince European regulators to do some data collection like there is in the US. So obviously we can do some analysis within the US, because there, if you are familiar with the DOT databases, there is quite a wealth of data there that can be utilized to some analysis, but quantifying the effect within the US, it's probably of limited use. And hopefully European regulators will develop such a system for European countries, and then we could see more clearly what is coming in and out of the European Union. And then maybe once we demonstrate the need for such databases, maybe other data providers will also start collecting data that is more cargo oriented. So that's on the data side. Second, we need to establish the need for general cargo research. And to that end, we need to start collaborating more closely with those who are interested in this kind of research, cargo providers, other entities along the supply chains, policymakers. So what I hope to take from here is maybe to have a special issue with call for research on cargo.
Interesting. Anne, what are your thoughts?
Do I need to echo the
Thing with the data, I think everyone got that point, right? But beyond
is data
that,
important? Is data important? I hadn't picked that up.
well, I mean, and beyond that, I think what also is one kind of obstacle maybe is this realization that I think at the conference somebody, and I very much like that, somebody said that the issue about cargo is that cargo doesn't speak and cargo doesn't vote. So it may not be that much at the tip of the head of people, of the policymakers, if you want. So I do see limited funding opportunities out there, like publicly supported funding opportunities for research in air cargo, or maybe in cargo in general, are not as prominent. I think there's way more on how to improve the travel or the mobility needs of passengers. When we look into mobility transition research in general, I personally have the impression that it's very much focused to passenger transport, which obviously has an interconnection with what we're speaking about, but it's not only that. And I find that as management researchers, when we try to do research on air cargo or on cargo in general, the feedback oftentimes is, well, why don't the airlines, why don't the cargo carriers, why don't the logistic service providers fund your work? Right? For passengers, it's like, yeah, nobody's going to say, well, go out to the street and have the passengers fund your research on this type of stuff. And obviously there's public money for it. But when we speak about reducing emissions from aviation, for instance, it's like, yeah, but it should be in the interest of the companies that do this. And I find this is to some degree an obstacle, and I would love to come more to the tip of the hat of the policymakers there to put the incentives out for research as well.
Right. Carlos, is this sort of research of interest to the industry, do you think?
I think it would be. My take is that air cargo needs more attention, but perhaps not so much the air part. If I may be ever so blunt, I think we discussed, or at least we pointed out that drivers for air cargo at the beginning of this chat, and it's about trade, really. The big driver of air cargo is trade. So when you look at air cargo, you're not just looking at a typical aviation operation. You're looking at something that's much wider. The impact on the overall economy needs to be better understood, and perhaps parcels don't vote, but those who ship them and those who manufacture what's in there and those who export what's in them do. So this wider understanding of the role that air cargo plays in the global economy needs to be better understood by policymakers. But it's not really just about aviation. Aviation is an important part, of course, but air cargo is really part of a much wider logistics chain.
Right.
So
Okay,
yes, we would
we
be
are
interested in
practically out of time. So I'm going to start Carlos, Anne, and then you, Benny. What does cargo, the title of today's session is Giving Cargo What It Deserves. What does cargo deserve?
new policies.
I beg your pardon?
New policies.
New policies. Policies at all. And
Big attention.
more
In
attention.
the sense of COVID was the first time people understood what transportation research can be about.
Right.
Agree.
I think
fully
we're
agree.
struggling to hear you a little bit there, but I think what you said was more attention. Yeah,
Yeah,
very good.
public
Benny?
attention is what I tried to say.
Well, I agree with Anna. I was thinking the same, more attention and the respect it deserves from serving value chains around the globe.
Thank you. And I think our conference last year was a good first step. Well, it was a first step. I thought it was a good step. So, ladies and gentlemen, that we're out of time, but I think you'd agree that we could have talked for us significantly longer on that night. That said, ladies and gentlemen, let me tell you two more things. This is the first in a series of webinars. They will be always the last Monday at 1300 European time, last Monday of every month. The next last Monday of February, indeed the only last Monday of February, is the 26th of February. And the webinar is a discussion about technology and where do we go and what comes next and so forth, given that aviation's got a glorious history of being a leader in the technology area. And then bringing this sort of session to more of a close, the one after that, which is on the 25th of March, is about how do we marry cargo and technology and cargo and new technology. So the conversation we started today, we will carry on very much in that one. I hope you can make it to all of them. Thank you so much for being here today. So please join with me and at least metaphysically thanking Benny and Carlos for their very useful contributions. And thanks very much. And I wish you all a very good day.